In the quiet town of Meadow Creek, Texas, life was simple, built around faith and routine. Reverend Caleb Turner stood at the heart of the community, a preacher with a silver tongue and a commanding presence. His sermons filled the pews every Sunday, and his guidance was sought by many, including Laura Daniels, the wife of a rancher named Tom. Laura was a woman of striking beauty, her golden hair and soft blue eyes captivating anyone who looked her way. But beneath her flawless exterior was a profound loneliness. Her marriage to Tom had grown stale, their love replaced by routine and indifference. She sought solace at the church, hoping prayer would fill the void her husband no longer could. Caleb noticed Laura early on, her attentive gaze lingering on him longer than most. It began innocently enough. She approached him after a service, asking for guidance. Caleb, always eager to help a member of his flock, offered private counseling sessions. Their conversations started with scripture, but soon shifted to personal confessions. Laura spoke of her isolation, her longing for connection. Caleb, too, shared his struggles, painting himself as a man burdened by his role as a spiritual leader. The connection between them grew stronger, and late one evening, under the dim light of the church's stained glass windows, their shared vulnerabilities led to a single act of passion. One became many, their affair intensifying with every secret rendezvous. They were careful, meeting in shadowed corners of the town where no one would think to look. But secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of surfacing. Months later, Laura discovered she was pregnant. Her heart raced with panic as she realized the child could not be her husband's. Tom, thrilled at the prospect of becoming a father, showered her with affection for the first time in years. But Laura felt trapped, torn between her husband's newfound kindness and the preacher who now avoided her calls and eyes during sermons. Caleb's once soothing words turned cold, his demeanor distant as he begged her to keep quiet about their affair. Laura grew desperate. She wanted Caleb to leave with her, to start a new life far from Meadow Creek, but he refused. For him, the risk was too great, losing his position, his reputation, and the trust of the congregation. Their arguments became heated, each meeting more volatile than the last. Tom began to suspect something was wrong. Late one night, he followed Laura when she claimed she was going to visit a friend. His suspicions were confirmed when he saw her car parked outside a rundown motel. Inside, Caleb and Laura were locked in a furious argument, her voice raised as she accused him of abandoning her. Tom stormed into the room, fists clenched, his rage barely contained. The confrontation turned violent. Tom attacked Caleb, and in the struggle, a lamp shattered, sending glass across the floor. Laura tried to intervene, but it was too late. Caleb struck his head against the corner of a table and collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. The room fell silent, the weight of what had happened sinking in. Tom stared at his wife in disbelief, his anger replaced by horror. Laura, trembling, begged him to help her cover it up. Together they dragged Caleb's lifeless body to his truck and drove it to the edge of a nearby canyon. In the dead of night, they pushed the vehicle over the edge, watching as it disappeared into the darkness below. The next morning, the town awoke to news of the preacher's tragic accident. Caleb Turner was mourned as a man of faith and virtue, his sins buried alongside him. Laura and Tom returned to their lives, bound now by a secret neither could ever reveal. But in the shadows of their quiet home, the weight of their crime lingered, a constant reminder that even in a town built on faith, no soul is without sin. In the weeks following Reverend Caleb Turner's death, the town of Meadow Creek was awash with grief. The church held a memorial service that drew every soul in the community. Mourners spoke of Caleb's devotion, his guiding words, and the way he had uplifted the downtrodden. Laura Daniels sat in the front pew with Tom, her face a mask of sorrow that hid the storm within. The secret she shared with her husband had transformed their relationship. Where there had been distance, now there was a suffocating closeness. Tom watched her constantly, his once indifferent demeanor replaced by a simmering intensity. He didn't trust her, though he pretended otherwise. Every glance, every step she took outside their home was met with suspicion. Laura, in turn, was haunted by Caleb's absence. She replayed their last moments over and over in her mind, the anger in his voice, the final look of betrayal in his eyes before he fell. Her guilt consumed her, but she couldn't show it. Instead, she focused on the growing life inside her, a constant reminder of the man she'd lost and the web of lies she now lived within. The town sheriff, Hank Greer, wasn't entirely convinced by the story of Caleb's accident. The truck had been found at the bottom of the canyon, its cab crushed, but something about it didn't sit right with him. The path the vehicle had taken didn't match a simple loss of control. And then there were the marks, small bloodstains in the truck bed that suggested a body had been moved before the crash. Hank, a man who had seen his share of small-town secrets, began asking questions, his eyes narrowing on the Daniels household. Tom grew paranoid. He knew Hank wasn't the type to let things go. One evening, over a bottle of whiskey, he confronted Laura. His words slurred, but his accusations sharp. He demanded to know if she had told anyone. Laura denied it vehemently, her voice trembling. Tom grabbed her wrist, his grip bruising as he warned her to stay silent. "If this gets out," he growled, "we're both finished." But Laura wasn't sure how much longer she could hold up under the weight of it all. The walls of their home seemed to close in on her. Each day, a struggle to maintain the facade of a grieving wife. One night, unable to sleep, she crept into the nursery she'd been preparing. Sitting in the dimly lit room, she whispered to the child in her belly, apologizing for the sins that had brought them both to this moment. Meanwhile, Hank's investigation continued quietly. He visited the motel where Caleb had last been seen, speaking to the clerk who remembered a blonde woman meeting the preacher there on more than one occasion. The sheriff's suspicions deepened, but he needed more than whispers and rumors. The turning point came when a mechanic inspecting Caleb's truck found something wedged in the frame, a small gold earring. Hank recognized it immediately. It matched a pair Laura had worn to church many times. Hank visited the Daniels ranch the next day. Laura saw his car pull up and felt her stomach drop. Tom stepped outside to greet the sheriff, his jaw tight. The two men exchanged tense words, their voices carrying into the house. Laura watched from the window, her pulse racing. Finally, Hank asked to speak with Laura. Tom hesitated but eventually called her outside. Standing in the cool evening air, Laura faced the sheriff, her heart pounding in her chest. Hank's tone was calm but firm as he asked her about the earring, about the night of Caleb's death, and about her relationship with the preacher. Tom interrupted, insisting they had nothing to say. But Laura, overwhelmed by guilt and fear, broke down. Tears streaming down her face, she confessed everything: the affair, the pregnancy, the fight, and the cover-up. Tom's face twisted in rage, but before he could react, Hank drew his pistol, ordering him to stand down. The quiet night erupted into chaos as Tom lunged at the sheriff, shouting that Laura had ruined everything. Hank restrained him with difficulty, calling for backup. By the time the deputies arrived, the truth was laid bare. The town of Meadow Creek would never be the same. Laura, her secret now public, was charged with obstruction of justice, though her cooperation spared her from harsher penalties. Tom, however, faced a murder charge, his anger and jealousy sealing his fate. As Laura sat in the back of a police car, her hands trembling, she realized that her freedom had come at a cost. Caleb was gone, Tom was lost, and her reputation was shattered. All she had left was the child growing inside her, a fragile promise of redemption in a life forever marked by betrayal and blood. Months passed after the arrests of Laura and Tom Daniels, and the town of Meadow Creek remained gripped by the scandal. The trial of Tom Daniels was a spectacle, drawing reporters from across Texas to the small courthouse. Every sordid detail of the affair, the confrontation, and the cover-up came to light, tearing apart the idyllic image of the Daniels family and tarnishing the legacy of Reverend Caleb Turner. Laura, granted a deal in exchange for her testimony against Tom, sat on the witness stand with trembling hands. Her voice cracked as she recounted the events of that fateful night. She spared no detail, knowing her words could mean the difference between life and death for her unborn child. The jury watched her closely, some with pity, others with disdain. Tom's defense painted him as a man driven to the brink by betrayal, a husband who had been provoked into a crime of passion. But the evidence, the bloodstains, the shattered lamp, and Laura's testimony was damning. After a week of deliberations, the jury found him guilty of second-degree murder. Tom was sentenced to 25 years in prison, his stoic demeanor betraying no emotion as the judge read the verdict. Laura was released shortly after the trial. Though she avoided prison, her freedom came with its own sentence. Meadow Creek had no place for her anymore. Whispers followed her wherever she went, judgmental eyes peeking out from behind curtains as she walked down the street. The church where she once sought solace was now a place of condemnation, its congregation shunning her for the sins that had unraveled their community. With nowhere else to go, Laura packed her belongings and left Meadow Creek, driving east toward Dallas. She found a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, where no one knew her name or her past. It was a fresh start, though loneliness clung to her like a shadow. The months of isolation gave her time to reflect. She often thought of Caleb, his voice echoing in her mind as she tried to make sense of the choices that had led to his death. She thought of Tom, sitting in a prison cell, his anger festering, and she thought of the child she carried, the only light in a life otherwise darkened by regret. When her son was born, Laura named him Jacob. Holding him in her arms for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope she hadn't known in months. Jacob was her chance to break the cycle, to create a life untainted by the sins of the past. She vowed to raise him with honesty and love, shielding him from the shadows of Meadow Creek. But the past has a way of lingering. One evening, as she rocked Jacob to sleep, a letter arrived in her mailbox. It was from Tom. The envelope was worn, the handwriting unmistakable. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single page, the words scrawled in a mix of anger and sorrow. Tom blamed her for his imprisonment, for the destruction of their life together. But there was something else, a warning. He claimed that the truth about Caleb's death wasn't as simple as she believed. Tom hinted that Caleb had secrets of his own, ones that could change everything if they ever came to light. Laura stared at the letter, her mind racing. Could it be true? Had Caleb been hiding something even darker than their affair? The questions gnawed at her, threatening to pull her back into the nightmare she had fought so hard to escape. As Jacob stirred in her arms, Laura made a decision. She couldn't let the past consume her again. For her son's sake, she had to move forward. Yet, deep in her heart, she knew the shadow of Meadow Creek would never fully disappear. The secrets and lies that had led to Caleb's death would remain buried, for now. But truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's hidden. Life in Dallas settled into a fragile rhythm for Laura and her son Jacob, though the shadow of Tom's letter lingered in the back of her mind. She threw herself into motherhood, working long hours at a diner to make ends meet while ensuring Jacob had everything he needed. His laughter became her solace, his tiny hands a reminder that she still had something worth fighting for. Yet, on quiet nights, when the world was still, Laura's thoughts often returned to Meadow Creek and to Tom's cryptic warning. What secrets could Caleb Turner have possibly kept from her? She had convinced herself she knew him, had loved him, even as their affair teetered on the edge of destruction. But the idea that she had only scratched the surface of his life gnawed at her, filling her dreams with fragmented images of Caleb's face and whispers she couldn't quite decipher. One afternoon, as Jacob napped, Laura sifted through a box of items she'd brought from Meadow Creek. Most of it was mundane: old photographs, church pamphlets, a locket Caleb had given her. At the bottom of the box was a folded sheet of paper, yellowed with time. It was a sermon Caleb had been working on, one he had never delivered. The handwriting was familiar, but the message was unsettling. Caleb had written about temptation and betrayal, referencing scripture in a way that felt pointed. But near the end, his tone shifted. He wrote about fear. Fear of sins exposed. Fear of losing everything. Laura's pulse quickened as she noticed a small note scrawled in the margin. "The ledger is my salvation. They can't touch me as long as it's safe." The words made no sense to her, but they stirred something deep in her gut. Was this the secret Tom had hinted at in his letter? Was there something Caleb had hidden, something so important it could have changed everything? Haunted by the possibility, Laura made a decision she'd been avoiding for months. She would go back to Meadow Creek, not to reconcile with her past, but to find answers. When she arrived in town, the air was thick with tension. The people who had once welcomed her with open arms now avoided her gaze, their judgment palpable. Ignoring their stares, Laura went to the church. It was locked, but she knew where Caleb had kept a spare key. Inside, the building felt hollow, its familiar warmth replaced by an eerie silence. Laura walked through the aisles, her footsteps echoing against the walls. She made her way to Caleb's office, where their affair had begun. It was undisturbed, as though time had frozen the room in place. She searched through his desk drawers, rifling through papers and journals, but found nothing of significance. Frustrated, she sat back in his chair, her eyes scanning the room. That's when she noticed the bookshelf. Caleb had always been meticulous, arranging the books by theme and author, but one shelf was slightly out of place, its books pushed unevenly to one side. She pulled them out, one by one, until her fingers brushed against something hidden in the back. It was a leather-bound ledger, its edges worn from use. Laura opened it carefully, her heart pounding. The pages were filled with names, dates, and amounts of money, thousands of dollars, exchanged in secret. It became clear that Caleb had been involved in something far more sinister than she could have imagined. Beneath his veneer of righteousness, he had been laundering money for a local crime syndicate. Laura's hands trembled as she pieced it together. Caleb hadn't just feared exposure for their affair. He had feared the men he worked with, men who wouldn't hesitate to kill if they suspected betrayal. She realized with chilling clarity that his death might not have been an accident of passion, but part of a larger scheme. As she stared at the ledger, a voice startled her. "I knew you'd come back." Laura turned to see Sheriff Hank Greer standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" she asked, clutching the ledger to her chest. Hank stepped into the room, his gaze fixed on the book in her hands. Caleb's secrets weren't just his to keep. You're in over your head, Laura. That book ties you to things you don't want to be part of. Laura backed away, fear creeping into her voice. You knew about this? About him? Hank sighed, his face shadowed with regret. I knew enough to stay out of it. But now that you've dug it up, they'll come looking. You should have stayed away. The weight of his words hit her like a blow. Caleb's death, Tom's warnings, even her return. It had all led her to this moment. And now, holding the ledger, she was caught in the middle of something far more dangerous than she'd imagined. Hank stepped closer. Give me the book, Laura. Let me handle this. But Laura hesitated. Could she trust him? Or was Hank as deeply entwined in Caleb's web as the preacher himself had been? The answer wasn't clear, but one thing was. Laura couldn't afford another mistake. Laura's fingers tightened around the leather-bound ledger as she backed further into Caleb's office. Sheriff Hank Greer's imposing figure blocked the doorway, his eyes fixed on the incriminating book in her hands. The tension in the air was suffocating, and every instinct told her that trusting him could lead to disaster. I'm not giving it to you, Laura said, her voice trembling but resolute. I don't even know whose side you're on. Hank's jaw clenched, his calm demeanor cracking. You don't understand what you've stepped into, Laura. Caleb wasn't just playing with fire. He built the whole damn inferno. That ledger could get you killed. Laura's mind raced. Caleb had hidden this book for a reason. If it was as dangerous as Hank claimed, then handing it over might only trade one threat for another. Who are they? She asked, her voice sharper now. Who's behind all this? Hank hesitated, his hand brushing the badge on his chest, as though its weight reminded him of the lines he'd already crossed. People you don't want to meet, he said finally. The men Caleb worked for don't forgive loose ends. That book is their lifeline. Names, payouts, everything. If they find out you have it, you're dead. The sheriff took a step closer, lowering his voice. You're not equipped to handle this, Laura. Hand it over, and I'll make sure it disappears. Laura's gut twisted. She didn't trust Hank's sudden urgency. If he had known about Caleb's involvement with criminals, why hadn't he acted before? Was he complicit? Or was he trying to clean up a mess he hadn't expected her to uncover? I need time to think, she said, stalling. There's no time, Hank snapped, the crack in his voice betraying his rising desperation. If they realize it's missing, they'll come after you. And your son. The mention of Jacob sent a wave of cold fear through her. She couldn't let anything happen to him, but she also couldn't make a rash decision. Her grip on the ledger tightened as her eyes darted to the office window. In one fluid motion, Laura bolted for it. She threw open the window and climbed through, clutching the book against her chest as Hank's shouts rang out behind her. The sheriff cursed, scrambling to follow, but Laura had already hit the ground running. The streets of Meadow Creek were dark and empty, the quiet town asleep under the weight of its secrets. Laura's breath came in gasps as she sprinted toward her car, parked 2 blocks away. She could hear Hank's footsteps pounding behind her, his voice calling out, ordering her to stop. She reached the car and fumbled with her keys, her shaking hands barely able to fit the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and she tore out of the parking lot, just as Hank reached the corner. His figure disappeared in the rearview mirror, but Laura knew this wasn't over. Driving out of town, she gripped the wheel tightly, her mind racing. Hank was right about one thing. This ledger was a death sentence in the wrong hands. But if she wanted to protect herself and Jacob, she needed leverage. The only way to end this was to confront the source of the danger. The names in the ledger blurred in her mind as she drove through the night. One name stood out above the rest, circled multiple times in Caleb's cramped handwriting. Asterisk, asterisk, Daniel Grayson, dot, asterisk, asterisk. He was the linchpin, the man Caleb had worked for, and likely the one who would stop at nothing to retrieve the ledger. Laura pulled into a dingy motel, just off the highway. She needed a plan, but first, she needed rest. Locking the door and wedging a chair under the handle, she sat on the edge of the bed, the ledger open in her lap. Her eyes scanned the pages, noting the sheer scale of Caleb's operation. Bribes to local officials, payoffs to keep witnesses silent, and even large sums funneled into offshore accounts. This wasn't just a small-town scandal. It was a criminal empire. The realization hit her like a freight train. Caleb hadn't been a victim of circumstance. He had built this life, step by step, and dragged her into it without her even knowing. As the sun began to rise, Laura made her decision. She couldn't run forever. If she wanted to protect Jacob, she had to expose the truth, not just about Caleb's death, but about everything. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed someone outside of Meadow Creek, someone with the power to take this higher without being pulled into the corruption. Laura picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. Her brother Ethan, a journalist living in Houston. When he answered, his voice groggy, she wasted no time. "Ethan, I need your help, and I need you to listen carefully. My life depends on it." Ethan listened in stunned silence as Laura poured out the truth about Caleb, the affair, the murder, and the ledger that could bring an empire crashing down. His initial disbelief quickly gave way to the steely resolve of a seasoned journalist. When she finished, there was a long pause on the line. "Laura," Ethan finally said, his voice steady, "this is huge, but if what you're saying is true, you're in way over your head. You can't do this alone." "That's why I'm calling you," she replied, her voice trembling. "I need someone I can trust. You're the only person left." Ethan agreed to meet her in a safe location, halfway between Dallas and Houston. He promised to bring the necessary resources to dig into the ledger's contents and make sure the story was airtight. More importantly, he said, they needed to secure the ledger somewhere it couldn't be destroyed or stolen. The meeting point was a nondescript diner off a desolate stretch of highway. Laura arrived early, parking in a spot that allowed her to see the entrance and the road leading up to it. She kept the ledger in her lap, her eyes scanning the horizon. Every passing car made her pulse race. When Ethan finally arrived, his presence brought a wave of relief. He was older than Laura remembered, with streaks of gray in his dark hair and the same sharp eyes that had gotten him into trouble as a kid. He embraced her tightly, then ushered her inside. Over coffee, Laura slid the ledger across the table. Ethan flipped through it, his face growing darker with each page. "This isn't just corruption," he said, his voice low. "This is systemic. There are judges, law enforcement, even state officials on here. If this goes public..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implications were clear. "Can you handle it?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded. "I can. But this is dangerous, Laura. If these people find out you've exposed them, they won't just come after you. They'll come after Jacob." Her stomach churned. She had known the risks, but hearing them spoken aloud made them all the more real. "What do we do?" Ethan leaned closer. "First, I'll make copies of this and send them to trusted contacts. Journalists, attorneys, people who can act if anything happens to me. Then, I'll start digging into these names, confirming connections. But you, he hesitated. You need to disappear for a while. Take Jacob and go somewhere no one can find you. Laura shook her head. I've been running long enough. I can't leave you to deal with this alone. Ethan placed a hand over hers. You don't have a choice. If they find out we're working together, they'll come after both of us. The best thing you can do is protect your son. Before Laura could respond, the sound of tires screeching outside cut through the air. Ethan's head snapped toward the window, and Laura's blood ran cold. A black SUV had pulled into the parking lot, its tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. Is that one of them? Ethan whispered, his voice tense. I don't know, Laura replied, panic rising in her chest. The diner's door swung open, and two men in dark suits stepped inside. Their eyes scanned the room before locking onto Laura and Ethan. Go, Ethan said under his breath, sliding the ledger back to her. Take the back exit, now. What about you? I'll buy you time, he said firmly. Just go. Laura hesitated for a split second before grabbing the ledger and slipping out of the booth. She moved quickly but quietly, heading toward the kitchen and the back door. Behind her, she heard the men approach Ethan's table. Where is she? One of them demanded. Ethan's voice was calm but defiant. I don't know who you're talking about. Laura pushed open the back door and stepped into the alley, clutching the ledger tightly against her chest. She spotted her car parked a few feet away and sprinted toward it, her heart pounding. As she climbed into the driver's seat, a gunshot rang out from inside the diner. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she froze. But then, her survival instincts kicked in. She started the car and sped away, tears streaming down her face as she left her brother behind. She didn't know if Ethan was alive or dead. All she knew was that the men hunting her were closer than ever. And now, there was no turning back. The road blurred as Laura sped through the desolate Texas night, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. Jacob's tiny car seat in the back was a fragile reminder of her purpose: survival. The weight of the ledger in her passenger seat felt heavier than ever, its contents a dangerous secret that could destroy powerful lives, and her own. Her mind raced. Ethan's fate was unknown, and guilt gnawed at her. She had abandoned him, left him to face the men hunting her, but she couldn't risk staying. Her brother had known the stakes, and she had no choice but to trust his sacrifice wasn't in vain. She needed to disappear. 2 hours later, Laura pulled into a secluded motel off a back road. It was the kind of place where people didn't ask questions, where anonymity was currency. She paid in cash and carried Jacob inside, her every movement heavy with paranoia. Inside the dingy room, Laura bolted the door and set up a barricade with a chair. She placed the ledger in her bag and sat on the edge of the bed, cradling Jacob in her arms. He stirred, his tiny hand brushing her cheek. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to cry. Morning came too quickly. Exhaustion clouded her mind, but there was no time to rest. She flipped through her burner phone's contacts, searching for someone she could trust. Ethan had been her only connection to the outside world, and now she was utterly alone. Her thoughts turned to the ledger. If Ethan had been right, its information could be her only weapon. The powerful men Caleb had worked for wouldn't stop until they recovered it, but she couldn't destroy it. It was the only leverage she had. She needed help. Laura remembered a name from her past. ***. Detective Maria Vega. ***. A no-nonsense investigator who had transferred out of Meadow Creek years ago. Maria had once helped Laura through a rough patch in her marriage. She wasn't corrupt, and she owed Laura a favor. Laura hesitated but dialed the number. The line rang twice before a sharp, familiar voice answered. Vega. Maria, it's Laura Daniels, she said, her voice cracking. A pause. Then, Laura, what's going on? It's been years. I don't have time to explain everything, Laura said, her words tumbling out. I'm in trouble. Big trouble. Caleb Turner's name mean anything to you? Another pause. This time, longer. Yeah, it does. Heard he died in an accident. It wasn't an accident, Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. And there's a lot more to the story. I have proof. Names, dates, everything. But people are after me, Maria. Dangerous people. Maria's tone shifted, her voice calm and measured. Where are you? Are you safe? For now, Laura replied. But I need to meet. I need someone I can trust. Maria sighed. All right. There's a diner in Amarillo. Sammy's on the west side. Meet me there in 6 hours. Don't bring anyone, and don't talk to anyone on the way. Thank you, Laura whispered, relief flooding her. She hung up and immediately started packing. Jacob stirred awake as she strapped him into the car seat. She whispered soothing words to him, masking her fear. The drive to Amarillo was uneventful, though Laura remained hyper-aware of every car that passed, every shadow that moved. When she arrived at Sammy's, the parking lot was mostly empty. She parked far from the entrance and carried Jacob inside, her bag slung over her shoulder. Maria was already there, sitting in a booth near the back. Her sharp eyes scanned the room before landing on Laura. She rose to greet her, her expression unreadable. You look like hell, Maria said bluntly, as Laura slid into the booth. Feels like it, Laura replied, clutching her bag tightly. Maria glanced at Jacob, her expression softening for a moment. He's beautiful, she said. Then her tone hardened again. All right, talk. What's going on? Laura pulled out the ledger and placed it on the table. Maria's eyes widened as she flipped through the pages, her face growing darker with each revelation. This, Maria began, shaking her head. This is massive. These names, judges, officers, politicians, they're all connected. Yes, Laura said. Caleb was laundering money for them, and now they're after me because I have that. Maria leaned back, her jaw tightening. You've got a nuclear bomb here, Laura. No wonder they're chasing you. If this gets out, it'll blow the roof off half the state. So what do I do? Laura asked, desperation creeping into her voice. Maria looked at her, her expression grim. You don't do anything. You let me handle it. I know someone in the FBI, a clean agent, not tied to any of this. They can protect you, but you have to trust me. Trust you? Laura snapped. I trusted Ethan, and now he might be dead. Maria's eyes softened. I'm sorry about your brother, but if you want to survive this, you have to let me take the lead. Before Laura could respond, the door to the diner swung open. 2 men entered, their suits too sharp for the rural setting. Maria's eyes narrowed as she reached for her waistband. They're here, she said calmly, her hand brushing the handle of her gun. Laura's blood ran cold. She grabbed Jacob and slid out of the booth. What do we do? Maria's eyes didn't leave the men. Go out the back, now. I'll hold them off. I can't leave you. Go, Maria barked, her voice firm. With no other choice, Laura grabbed the ledger and bolted toward the kitchen, her heart pounding as Jacob whimpered in her arms. Behind her, she heard Maria's voice rise, followed by the unmistakable crack of a gunshot. The nightmare wasn't over yet. Laura ran through the kitchen of the diner, clutching Jacob tightly, her breath ragged. The sound of gunfire echoed behind her, sharp and terrifying, but she didn't dare look back. Her only thought was to get out, to escape with her son before the men caught up to her. She burst through the back door and into the alley, her mind racing. Her car was parked nearby, but she couldn't risk the main roads now. They'd be watching for her. She had to disappear. Laura spotted a delivery truck idling at the far end of the alley, the driver unloading boxes at the rear of the diner. Without hesitation, she approached, her heart pounding in her chest. "Please," she said, desperation thick in her voice. "I need a ride. I'll pay you. Just, please." The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, looked at her, then at Jacob, who was starting to cry. Whatever he saw in her face made him nod. "Get in," he said simply. Laura climbed into the back of the truck, cradling Jacob as the driver closed the doors behind them. She felt the vehicle rumble to life and start moving, carrying her away from the chaos. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to breathe. The ride gave her time to think. She opened the ledger again, flipping through its damning pages. The names, the numbers, they were power and danger in equal measure. If she destroyed it, she might buy herself some safety. But she'd also be letting the men who killed Caleb, hunted Ethan, and now pursued her walk free. She thought of Maria, the determination in her eyes as she faced those men. Laura didn't know if the detective was alive or dead, but she knew one thing. Maria had risked everything to protect her. That sacrifice couldn't be in vain. The truck stopped hours later at a warehouse on the outskirts of a small town. The driver opened the doors, and Laura climbed out, thanking him quietly before slipping away. She needed a new plan. She needed to end this. The only way to survive was to strike first. Laura found a payphone at a gas station and dialed a number Maria had scribbled on the edge of the ledger before they parted. It rang twice before a low, calm voice answered. "Agent Carter," the man said. "This is Laura Daniels," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "Maria Vega sent me. I have evidence, proof of a criminal syndicate involving high-ranking officials. I need protection for me and my son." The line was silent for a moment. Then, "Where are you?" Laura hesitated. She couldn't be sure she could trust him, but Maria had believed in him. "I'll meet you halfway," she said. "I'll call again with the location." She hung up before he could respond and moved quickly, finding a cheap motel where she could lay low. Over the next 2 days, she planned her next steps, meticulously covering her tracks. She kept Jacob close, her love for him fueling her resolve. Finally, she arranged the meeting with Agent Carter in a remote rest stop, choosing a spot where she could see anyone approaching. She arrived early, hiding in the shadows with Jacob as she watched the area. When Carter appeared, he was alone, his demeanor calm but alert. Laura stepped out cautiously, the ledger clutched in one hand, Jacob in the other. "Miss Daniels," Carter said, his tone professional but kind. "You're safe now. Let's get you and your son somewhere secure." Laura hesitated, her instincts screaming at her not to trust anyone. "How do I know you're not one of them?" Carter's expression softened. "Because Maria trusted me. And because if I wanted to hurt you, I wouldn't have come alone." Laura studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. She handed him the ledger, her hands trembling as she let it go. "This is everything," she said. "Use it to stop them." "You have my word," Carter said. Within hours, Laura and Jacob were placed in protective custody, hidden far from the reach of the men who had pursued them. Carter kept his promise, using the ledger to launch a federal investigation that unraveled the syndicate Caleb had served. The names in the ledger became headlines, and arrests swept across the state, exposing corruption at the highest levels. Months later, Laura sat in a quiet, sunlit cabin in an undisclosed location. Jacob played on the floor with a toy truck, his laughter filling the room. For the first time in what felt like forever, Laura felt a fragile sense of peace. The scars of her ordeal would never fully heal. She had lost Ethan, Maria, and the life she'd once known. But she had gained something too, a chance to start over, free from the shadows of Meadow Creek. As she watched Jacob play, Laura vowed to protect him with everything she had. No matter what it took, she would never let the darkness touch him again.